Tonight I will tell you the story of one of Rome's most sacred women, a woman who took a vow of chastity for 30 years to tend Vesta's eternal flame. But what happens when such a woman falls in love? The punishment is death, buried alive. Flavia's story will make you question whether love is stronger than sanctity, whether the human heart can truly be bound by sacred vows, and what price we're willing to pay for forbidden desires. This is not just a tale of forbidden romance, but a journey into the very heart of what it means to be human when duty and desire collide. Over the next 3 hours, we'll walk with Flavia through every moment of her transformation from devoted priestess to woman consumed by passion, exploring the intricate details of Roman religious life, the weight of sacred obligations, and the terrible beauty of love that defies all reason. So before you settle in for this long journey through ancient Rome, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy these historical adventures, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to ancient Rome together, to a world where love could literally be a matter of life and death, where desire and duty waged war in the soul of one extraordinary woman. Picture this: Rome, 89 CE, during the reign of Emperor Domitian. The eternal city sprawls across its 7 hills like a marble dream made manifest, a testament to power, ambition, and divine favor that reaches into every corner of the known world. The Forum Romanum bustles with senators in purple-striped togas, debating the fate of distant provinces, merchants hawking exotic goods from lands so remote their names sound like poetry, and slaves hurrying about their master's business with the quiet efficiency that keeps an empire running smoothly. The Colosseum rises in magnificent splendor on the eastern edge of the city, its 4 stories of arches and columns creating a monument to Roman engineering that can hold 50,000 spectators. On days when the games are held, the roar of the crowd can be heard for miles as gladiators fight for their lives and wild beasts from Africa stalk prisoners across the sand-covered arena floor. The scent of blood and sawdust mingles with the aroma of roasted meat and spiced wine sold by vendors who work the crowds. Aqueducts stretch across the countryside like stone rainbows, bringing fresh water from mountain springs dozens of miles away to feed the empire's beating heart. The water flows through a network of pipes and channels so sophisticated that every district of the city has access to clean drinking water, public baths, and fountains that never run dry. It's a marvel of engineering that visitors from other lands can barely comprehend. This ability to make water flow uphill and across vast distances through nothing but human ingenuity and careful calculation. The Palatine Hill towers above it all, crowned with imperial palaces that gleam white and gold in the Mediterranean sun. Here, Emperor Domitian holds court in chambers decorated with precious stones from India, silk tapestries from China, and ivory carvings from the heart of Africa. The palace gardens are filled with exotic plants and animals brought from the farthest reaches of the empire, creating a living museum of Roman power and reach. But at the very heart of this magnificent city, in the shadow of the Palatine Hill where emperors sleep in golden chambers, surrounded by Praetorian guards, stands a simple round temple that holds more reverence than all the grand marble monuments combined. This is the Temple of Vesta, goddess of hearth and home, protector of Rome itself, guardian of the sacred fire that must never die. The temple is small, almost humble in its simplicity compared to the massive structures that surround it. No towering columns reach toward the heavens. No elaborate friezes tell stories of conquest and triumph. Instead, it speaks through pure form, a perfect circle of white marble, open to the sky like a cupped hand offering prayers to the gods, housing a flame that has burned continuously for over 6 centuries without ever being allowed to die. The Romans believe with absolute certainty that as long as this fire burns, their empire will endure. The flame is not merely symbolic, but literally connected to Rome's survival, should it ever be extinguished through neglect or accident. catastrophe will follow as surely as night follows day. The gods will withdraw their protection. Enemies will triumph over Roman legions. Earthquakes will topple temples. Plagues will ravage the population. And the eternal city will become nothing more than ruins, haunted by the ghosts of its former glory. This belief is so deeply embedded in Roman consciousness that entire military campaigns have been delayed when the flame flickered too low, and peace negotiations have been suspended when the fire's color suggested divine displeasure. Emperors have canceled important ceremonies, senators have postponed crucial votes, and merchants have delayed trading expeditions based on the appearance of Vesta's sacred flame. Within the temple's sacred walls burns this flame that must never die, tended by hands that have been consecrated to its service, fed with wood that has been blessed by priests who trace their authority back to Numa Pompilius, the legendary second king of Rome, who first established the sacred rituals that keep the gods' favor burning bright. 6 women guard this flame with their lives. 6 virgin priestesses chosen before they reach womanhood, plucked from their families like rare flowers before they can fully bloom, sworn to 30 years of absolute chastity, bound by vows more sacred than marriage, more binding than citizenship, more precious than life itself. They are the Vestal Virgins, the most honored and most constrained women in the Roman world, living goddesses who sacrificed their humanity to preserve the divine favor that keeps Rome strong. And our story begins with one of them, Flavia Maxima, a woman whose name would become whispered in forbidden corners of the city, whose choices would challenge everything Romans believed about duty, desire, and the price of sacred service. Her story is one that will unfold over years of hidden passion and mounting danger, a tale of love that defied the gods themselves and the terrible price that such defiance ultimately demanded. Flavia was not born to this calling, for no woman ever was. The selection of Vestals was too important to be left to human choice or family ambition. Instead, they were chosen by divine lottery, their names emerging from sacred urns and ceremonies that combined religious ritual with the stark randomness that Romans believed represented the will of the gods. When the previous Vestal, an aging woman named Cecilia, who had served faithfully for 3 decades, finally completed her years of service and was free to leave the temple to marry and bear children, the priests of Rome prepared for the solemn ceremony that would choose her replacement. The ritual took place at dawn in the temple of Vesta itself, with representatives from every major priestly college in attendance. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, second in religious authority only to the emperor himself, presided over the ceremony, wearing robes of pristine white wool and a head covering that marked his sacred office. Dozens of names were inscribed on bronze tablets, each one carefully checked for proper spelling and ancestry before being placed in a silver urn that had been used for this purpose for over 2 centuries. The families of eligible girls waited in tense silence outside the temple, knowing that their daughters' names lay among the bronze tablets, but unable to influence the outcome in any way. Some prayed to their household gods for their daughters to be chosen, seeing it as the ultimate honor that could befall a family. Others prayed with equal fervor that their children would be passed over, understanding that selection meant the end of all normal family relationships and the beginning of a life that would be both exalted and utterly isolated from ordinary human experience. The ceremony itself was surprisingly simple for something with such momentous consequences. After prayers were offered to Vesta and the other gods, asking for divine guidance in the selection, the Pontifex Maximus reached into the urn and withdrew a single bronze tablet. The silence in the temple was so complete that the scratching sound of metal against metal seemed to echo like thunder as he lifted the tablet and read the name inscribed upon it. Flavia was 8 when her name was spoken aloud by the Pontifex Maximus in a voice that carried to every corner of the temple and seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity even now, 15 years later, as if the shock of that moment had burned every detail into her memory with perfect precision. the way the morning light slanted through the temple's opening, creating golden bars across the marble floor, the smell of incense and burning herbs that made the air thick and sacred, the absolute silence that followed the announcement, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The shock that had rippled through the assembled crowd was almost physical in its intensity. Her mother's face had gone white as marble. Her father's hands had begun to tremble, and the mixture of awe and pity in the eyes of everyone who looked at her had been almost unbearable to witness. She was no longer just another child among many. She had been marked by the gods themselves, chosen for a destiny that set her apart from every other girl in Rome. She had been playing with her wooden dolls in the garden of her father's villa earlier that morning, completely innocent of the gravity that was about to reshape her entire existence. The villa was modest by patrician standards but comfortable, with rooms arranged around a central courtyard where a fountain played gentle music day and night. Her mother, Livia, had been weaving at her loom in the atrium, humming an old lullaby while her fingers worked a shuttle with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned domestic arts from childhood. The household slaves moved about their duties with the quiet efficiency that marked a well-ordered Roman home. In the kitchen, the cook prepared the morning meal of bread, honey, olives, and cheese, while in the courtyard, a gardener tended the herbs and vegetables that would flavor the day's meals. The slave who served as Flavia's nurse worked quietly at her own loom, creating the simple tunics and cloaks that would clothe the family through the changing seasons. It had been a morning like any other in the Flavius household, filled with the comfortable routines that made up domestic life for a prosperous Roman family. But all of that changed in an instant when destiny came calling in the form of a temple official bearing news that would transform their lives forever. The messenger arrived just as the family was breaking their fast in the traditional Roman manner, gathering in the atrium around low tables laden with simple but nourishing food. He wore the white robes of a temple official, and his presence immediately commanded respectful attention from every member of the household. Slaves stopped their work to listen. The cook emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, and even the family's pet cat seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Lucius Flavius Maximus, the official had announced, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority and divine mandate. Your daughter has been chosen by lot to serve the goddess Vesta. She will be taken to the temple tomorrow at dawn for the ceremony of dedication. You have until then to prepare her for her new life. The words seemed to hang in the air like physical things, reshaping reality around them with their terrible finality. There was no appeal from this decision, no way to petition for reconsideration or delay. The gods had spoken through the casting of lots, and their will was absolute and binding on all mortals, regardless of rank or wealth or personal desire. Flavia had looked up from her breakfast, a piece of honey-soaked bread still clutched in her small hand, not understanding why her mother suddenly began to weep great, silent tears that streamed down her cheeks like rain, why her father's face turned pale as marble and his hands began to tremble so violently that he had to set down his cup of watered wine, why the slaves stopped their work and stared at her with expressions that mixed reverence with profound sorrow. She was too young to comprehend that she had just been sentenced to a life without husband, without children, without the tender intimacies that most women took for granted. The concept of celibacy was meaningless to an 8-year-old child who had barely begun to understand the differences between men and women, let alone the physical and emotional implications of foregoing marriage forever. All she knew was that she would serve a goddess, tend a sacred fire, and live in a beautiful temple that she had glimpsed during religious festivals. It seemed, to her 8-year-old mind, rather like the beginning of a magical adventure, the kind of story her nurse told her about heroes chosen by the gods for special purposes. She had no way of understanding that she was saying goodbye to everything that might have made her happy in the way that ordinary women found happiness. How naive she had been, how utterly unprepared for the reality of what lay ahead. That final night in her family home was a blur of frantic preparations and tearful farewells that would haunt her memories for years to come. Her mother sat beside her bed, stroking her hair and whispering stories about the great honor that had befallen their family, though her voice broke repeatedly and her eyes never stopped leaking tears. She spoke of famous Vestals from history, women whose names were remembered with reverence centuries after their deaths, trying to help her daughter understand the magnitude of her destiny. Her father paced the villa like a caged animal, alternating between pride that his daughter had been chosen by the gods and grief that he was losing her to a world he could never enter. He tried to explain to her the importance of her new role, how she would help protect Rome itself through her service, but his words were clumsy with emotion and seemed to make little impression on her young mind. The slaves worked through the night, preparing the simple possessions she would be allowed to take with her. A few personal items, some clothes appropriate for a child entering religious service, a small wooden doll that had been her favorite toy since infancy. Everything else would be left behind, including the life she had known and the family who had loved her since her first breath. The transition from ordinary child to sacred virgin was abrupt, almost violent in its finality. One moment she was Flavia, daughter of Lucius, beloved child of a prosperous household, surrounded by family and servants who had known her since birth and would have died to protect her from harm. The next moment she was Flavia Maxima, Vestal Virgin, property of the goddess and the Roman state, belonging entirely to a world that existed separate from ordinary human concerns. They stripped away her childhood with methodical precision that spoke of centuries of practice and religious tradition. Her long dark hair, which her mother had lovingly braided each morning while telling her stories about the adventures they would have when she was older, was cut short in the manner of a Roman bride, for she was, in a very real sense, marrying Vesta herself, pledging herself to a divine relationship that would last 3 decades and demand absolute fidelity. Her childhood clothes, the bright tunics and soft slippers that marked her as a cherished daughter living under her father's protection, were replaced with the distinctive white robes of her order. These garments felt strange against her young skin, heavy with symbolism and expectation that she couldn't fully understand, but could sense in the way people looked at her once she was dressed in them. The ritual garments were beautiful in their simplicity, each piece carefully crafted according to traditions that stretched back centuries. The stola was a long woolen garment that covered her from neck to ankle, its white fabric so pure it seemed to glow in the temple's lamplight. The wool came from sheep that grazed in sacred pastures outside Rome, and it was woven by women who had taken special vows of purity for the duration of their work. Over the stola went the suffibulum, a short white cloak that marked her as set apart from ordinary women. This garment was fastened with a brooch that bore the sacred symbols of Vesta, crossed-grained stalks, and an eternal flame rendered in gold and precious stones. The cloak itself was designed to fall in graceful folds that would remain modest and dignified even during the most vigorous religious ceremonies. And most symbolically important of all, the vita, a white band that circled her head like a crown, marking her as untouchable, sacred, removed from the world of mortal desires and worldly concerns. Vita was made from the finest linen, bleached to perfect whiteness, and stiffened with secret techniques known only to the temple workshops. It was designed to be both beautiful and unmistakable, ensuring that anyone who saw her would immediately recognize her sacred status. The ceremony of dedication was both beautiful and terrifying to witness, a spectacle that drew thousands of Romans who understood they were seeing something that happened only once in a generation. The Temple of Vesta was filled to capacity with dignitaries, senators, and members of Rome's most important families, all dressed in their finest robes and gathered to witness this sacred transaction between the human and divine worlds. In the presence of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest who would become her spiritual father, closer to her than her birth father could ever be again, she spoke the words that would bind her for the next 30 years. The temple was filled with the sound of chanting priests, the smell of burning incense, and the weight of centuries of tradition that seemed to press down on her small shoulders like a physical thing. "I dedicate myself to the service of Vesta," she recited in her high, clear child's voice, the Latin words feeling strange and weighty on her tongue, heavy with meanings she couldn't fully comprehend but sensed was somehow larger than her ability to understand. "I pledge to guard her sacred flame with my life, to remain pure in body and spirit until the completion of my service, to honor the goddess above all earthly concerns, to serve Rome through my sacred duties until 30 years have passed and I am free to choose my own path." The words felt enormous in her small mouth, like trying to swallow something too large for her throat, but she spoke them clearly and without hesitation, guided by the patient coaching of the priests who had spent weeks preparing her for this moment. Around her, the assembled crowd listened in reverent silence, understanding that they were witnessing the transformation of an ordinary child into something sacred and set apart. When the ritual words were complete, Pontifex Maximus placed his hands on her head in the gesture of blessing that formally transferred her from her father's authority to that of the goddess. "Receive this child, Vesta," he intoned in a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the temple, "and make her a worthy guardian of your sacred flame. Grant her the strength to serve faithfully, the wisdom to understand your will, and the purity to remain unstained by worldly concerns." The priest smiled with satisfaction. The sacred flame flickered as if in divine approval, and her new sisters, 5 other Vestals of varying ages, ranging from a girl barely older than herself to a woman approaching the end of her service, welcomed her with solemn embraces that smelled of incense and sanctity. This was her home now, they told her in voices gentle but firm. This was where she belonged. This was where she would spend the next 30 years of her life, learning to serve the goddess and protect Rome through her sacred duties. For the first few years, sheltered by childhood innocence and the genuine religious fervor that seemed to come naturally to her young mind, it almost felt like that might be true. The Atrium Vesti, the house of the Vestals, was unlike any dwelling in the Roman Empire, a place that existed in the liminal space between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Built adjacent to the temple itself, it was a complex of elegant rooms, courtyards, and gardens where the 6 sacred women lived in splendid isolation from the world of ordinary mortals, their lives carefully structured around the rhythms of religious duty and spiritual contemplation. To step inside the Atrium Vesti was to enter a realm that had been designed with meticulous attention to every detail that might support lives dedicated entirely to divine service. The architecture itself seemed to breathe with sacred purpose, from the perfect proportions of the rooms to the subtle symbolic decorations that reminded the inhabitants at every turn of their holy calling and the weight of their responsibilities. The main courtyard was a masterpiece of architectural harmony that had taken decades to complete, surrounded by columns of the finest Carrara marble that gleamed like snow in the Mediterranean sunlight. These columns supported graceful arcades that provided shaded walkways around the perimeter of the space, allowing the Vestals to move between different sections of their house, while remaining protected from the weather and the curious eyes of outsiders. The courtyard floor was paved with intricate mosaics that told the story of Vesta's role in Roman religion and history. At the center, a magnificent fountain played gentle music day and night, its waters rising and falling in patterns that were said to reflect the goddess's moods and desires. The fountain was fed by the same sacred spring that provided water for the temple ceremonies, ensuring that even this decorative element served a religious purpose. Gardens bloomed throughout the complex with flowers sacred to Vesta, white roses that symbolized purity, lilies that represented rebirth and eternal life, and carefully tended herbs that were used in religious ceremonies. Each plant was chosen not only for its beauty but for its symbolic significance, creating a living text that could be read by those who understood the language of sacred botany. fish ponds scattered throughout the gardens reflected the changing sky, their still surfaces creating mirrors that seemed to capture pieces of heaven and hold them in place for contemplation. The fish themselves were considered sacred, and feeding them was one of the daily rituals that helped maintain the spiritual harmony of the house. To Roman eyes, the atrium vesti represented the height of female privilege and independence, a standard of living that exceeded that of many senators and military commanders. The Vestals were the only women in the empire who lived without male guardianship, free from the legal control of fathers or husbands that defined the existence of every other female in Roman society. They could own property in their own names, make wills and contracts, conduct business transactions without requiring male approval or oversight. Their legal privileges were extraordinary and unprecedented in a society that normally treated women as perpetual minors, requiring constant supervision. A Vestal's testimony in court was considered so sacred that it required no oath. Their word alone was sufficient to determine guilt or innocence in the most serious criminal cases. They could grant clemency to condemned criminals simply by touching them during their march to execution, and their presence at public ceremonies was believed to bring divine blessing to any enterprise. When they appeared in public, which they did regularly as part of their religious duties, they enjoyed honors that exceeded those accorded to the highest nobles. They had front row seats at gladiatorial games and theatrical performances, their white robes marking them as honored guests at every public spectacle. When they walked through the streets of Rome, crowds parted before them with reverent respect, and even the emperor himself would yield the right of way to a Vestal Virgin, dismounting from his litter or chariot to show proper deference to their sacred status. Their political influence was subtle but real. Emperors and senators sought their opinions on matters of state, understanding that their supposed connection to divine will gave their words special weight in the minds of the Roman people. They served as unofficial ambassadors during delicate negotiations, their presence lending an aura of divine approval to treaties and agreements. In many practical ways, they wielded power that exceeded that of senators or generals, though they were expected to exercise this influence only in service of religious and moral purposes. But privilege came with a price that most Romans preferred not to contemplate too closely, a cost measured not in gold or silver, but in the most fundamental human experiences that defined what it meant to be a woman in the ancient world. Flavia learned the rules of her new existence with the thoroughness that survival demanded, understanding from her earliest days in the temple that any deviation from perfect compliance could result in punishment that ranged from public humiliation to death. The sacred fire must never be allowed to die. If it did, the guilty Vestal would be stripped naked and scourged until blood ran down her back, then forced to rekindle the flame using only the ancient method of friction between pieces of sacred wood while the entire city watched and judged her worthiness. This punishment was not merely symbolic, but carried the weight of genuine religious terror. The Romans believed that allowing the sacred fire to die was tantamount to inviting the destruction of their entire civilization. The guilty Vestal would bear responsibility not just for her own failure, but for any disasters that might befall Rome as a result of divine displeasure. Earthquakes, military defeats, plagues, famines, all would be laid at her feet if she failed in this most basic of duties. Personal hygiene was a religious duty as much as a practical concern, elevated far beyond the normal Roman standards of cleanliness into a form of continuous worship. The Vestals bathed daily in water drawn from a sacred spring that was believed to have purifying properties beyond the merely physical. The bathing ritual itself was elaborate and ceremonial, involving specific prayers and gestures that transformed the simple act of washing into a form of devotional practice. Their bodies were considered temples in the most literal sense, housing souls that had been consecrated to divine service, and therefore requiring maintenance that reflected their sacred status. Every aspect of their physical care was governed by religious law. from the oils they used on their skin to the manner in which they arranged their hair. Even their fingernails were cut according to ritual prescriptions, with the clippings being burned in sacred fires rather than simply discarded. They rose before dawn every day to tend the flame, their first act upon waking being to check on the fire that represented Rome's survival and prosperity. Adding wood to the flame was not a simple matter of feeding a fire, but a complex ritual that required precise timing and careful attention to omens and signs. The wood had to be from specific trees: oak for strength and endurance, laurel for victory and honor, olive for peace and prosperity. And each piece was blessed with prayers and incense before being added to the fire. The color and behavior of the flame were constantly monitored for signs of divine favor or displeasure. A bright, steady fire was interpreted as a sign that the gods were pleased with Rome's conduct and would continue to protect the city. A fire that flickered excessively or burned with unusual colors was seen as a warning that required immediate attention and often led to elaborate ceremonies of purification and propitiation. They prepared the sacred salt cake used in religious ceremonies throughout the city, a task that required both physical skill and spiritual purity. The grain had to be ground by hand using millstones that were blessed for this specific purpose, with each Vestal taking turns at the grinding in a rotation that ensured no single person bore the entire burden of this essential work. The salt came from springs near the temple that were considered sacred to Vesta, and it had to be harvested and prepared according to rituals that had been passed down unchanged for centuries. The shaping of each cake was done by hand while reciting prayers that connected the physical act of preparation to its spiritual significance. The cakes themselves were not merely ritual objects, but were believed to carry actual divine power, making their proper preparation a matter of cosmic importance. Any mistake in the process could invalidate the entire batch, requiring the Vestals to begin again while seeking signs of what had gone wrong and how to prevent future errors. Water drawing was another daily ritual that connected them to the ancient traditions of their order and to the natural world that surrounded Rome. They drew water from the spring of Egeria, the nymph who was said to have advised King Numa on matters of religion and law when he established many of the rituals that still governed Roman religious practice. The water had to be carried in specially consecrated vessels that no other hands could touch, and it was used for purification ceremonies throughout the city. The journey to the spring was itself a form of meditation and prayer, requiring the Vestals to walk through parts of Rome that ordinary citizens rarely saw, while maintaining a state of spiritual concentration that allowed them to perceive signs and omens that might escape less trained observers. The water they brought back was used not only in their own ceremonies, but distributed to other temples and religious sites throughout the city, making them essential links in a web of religious observance that kept Rome in harmony with divine will. Most importantly, they guarded their virtue with a vigilance that bordered on religious mania, understanding that their sexual purity was not merely a personal matter, but a question of life and death for themselves and for the entire Roman Empire. A Vestal who lost her virginity didn't just face execution. She faced burial alive in an underground chamber called the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness, with a small amount of food and water, left to die slowly in darkness, while Rome tried to forget she had ever existed. This punishment was carefully designed to satisfy religious law while avoiding the technical violation of shedding the blood of a sacred person. The condemned Vestal was led in a funeral procession to an underground chamber that had been prepared like a tomb, complete with a bed, a lamp, and enough food and water to sustain life for a few days. She was then sealed inside while still alive, allowing the gods to determine the moment of her death rather than requiring human agency to carry out the execution. This wasn't mere punishment. It was religious necessity rooted in the deepest beliefs of Roman society about the connection between sexual purity and divine favor. A defiled Vestal was believed to bring divine wrath upon the entire city with consequences that could range from natural disasters to military defeats. Wars would be lost, plagues would ravage the population, earthquakes would topple temples, floods would destroy crops. The gods would withdraw their protection from Rome, leaving it vulnerable to every form of disaster that divine anger could devise. Better to bury one woman alive than to risk the gods' fury against millions of innocent citizens who had done nothing wrong but live in a city that harbored a defiled priestess. The logic was inexorable from a Roman perspective, and it ensured that the Vestals understood exactly what was at stake every moment of their lives. The eldest Vestal, Flavia Prima, who had served for 28 years and was close to completing her service and gaining her freedom, made sure the younger women understood this reality with perfect clarity. She was a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades contemplating the weight of their responsibilities, watching younger Vestals struggle with the challenges of their calling, and learning to recognize the signs of spiritual or emotional difficulty before they could develop into serious problems. Flavia Prima had seen Vestals break under the pressure of their vows, had witnessed the terrible ceremonies that followed when sacred trust was violated, and had developed a philosophy of vigilant supervision that some found oppressive, but which had successfully guided dozens of young women through the perils of their service. Her words carried the authority of long experience and unwavering faith, but also the weight of genuine care for the women under her guidance. "Never forget," she would say during their evening instruction sessions, her voice as cold and implacable as winter marble, but touched with undertones of genuine concern, "that Rome's fate rests between your legs. One moment of weakness, one lapse in judgment, one surrender to the desires of the flesh, and you condemn not just yourself, but every man, woman, and child in the empire. The gods do not forgive such betrayal, and neither will your fellow citizens." She would pause to let this sink in, studying the faces of the younger Vestals to ensure that they truly understood the magnitude of their responsibility. You are not ordinary women living ordinary lives with the luxury of making ordinary mistakes. You are living sacrifices, offered to Vesta for the protection of Rome. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every action you perform must be worthy of that sacred trust. Act accordingly. For her first decade of service, Flavia accepted this burden without question or complaint, finding genuine satisfaction in the demanding routines of ritual and prayer that structured her days. She threw herself into her duties with the fervor of true belief, understanding that she was part of something far larger and more important than her individual desires or preferences. She memorized every sacred formula, every prayer, every detail of ceremonial practice with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her knowledge might one day make the difference between divine favor and divine wrath. She learned to read the omens in the flame's dance, to detect the goddess's mood and the color and movement of the fire, to understand Vestas through signs that would be invisible to ordinary mortals who lacked the training and spiritual sensitivity that came with years of dedicated service. She studied the ancient texts that preserved the wisdom of their order, reading the stories of famous Vestals who had served Rome in times of crisis, and learning from their examples of courage, devotion, and sacrifice. She read about Claudia Quinta, who had saved the city by successfully calling upon the goddess Cybele during the darkest days of the Punic Wars, when it seemed that Hannibal might actually succeed in destroying Rome. About Tuccia, who had proven her innocence of charges of unchastity by miraculously carrying water in a sieve, demonstrating that divine power could transcend natural law when faith was pure and strong. About the unnamed Vestal, who had rekindled the sacred fire when it was accidentally extinguished during a festival, saving Rome from the divine wrath that would surely have followed such a catastrophic failure. These stories inspired her and gave her a sense of connection to something larger than herself, a tradition of service that stretched back through the centuries and linked her to every faithful woman who had ever tended the sacred flame. She was part of an unbroken chain of sacred service stretching back to the legendary King Numa, who had first established the Order of Vestal Virgins as part of his comprehensive reformation of Roman religious practice. Every day she tended the same fire that had burned during the reigns of kings and emperors, through wars and triumphs, plagues and celebrations. She was a guardian of continuity itself, a keeper of traditions that made Rome eternal and connected the present moment to both the mythical past and the glorious future that awaited the empire. By all accounts, she was a model Vestal Virgin, devout, dedicated, seemingly content with her sacred calling and fully committed to the life of service that had been chosen for her. Her superiors praised her attention to detail, her spiritual discipline, and her willingness to take on additional responsibilities when circumstances required it. She was seen as a young woman who had successfully made the transition from ordinary childhood to sacred adulthood, someone who could be counted on to serve faithfully for the remaining 20 years of her obligation. But as she grew from child to adolescent to young woman, as her body developed and her understanding of the world deepened, something began to stir within her that all the prayers and vows and sacred duties could not suppress. Something that challenged everything she had been taught about her nature and her destiny. Something that would ultimately force her to choose between the life she had been given and the life she had begun to dream of in the secret hours of the night. She began to notice men, not as abstract figures in the distance, not as the faceless masses who attended religious ceremonies, but as individuals with faces and voices and bodies that stirred unfamiliar sensations in her own flesh. And that awakening would change everything about her carefully ordered existence, setting in motion events that would test not only her own faith and resolve, but the very foundations of Roman religious belief. The transformation was so gradual that she barely noticed it at first, like the changing of seasons that happens so slowly that one day you suddenly realize that winter has become spring without your being aware of the precise moment of transition. But looking back, she would identify her 18th birthday as the beginning of the end of her innocence, the day when she first felt the stirring of desires that had no place in her consecrated life. It started innocuously enough, as these dangerous awakenings often do, with what seemed like nothing more than a momentary distraction during a routine religious ceremony. Flavia was 18, 10 years into her service, when she first felt the stirring of desires that would ultimately transform her from a model Vestal Virgin into a woman consumed by forbidden passion. The occasion was the Perilia, one of the most important festivals in the Roman calendar, celebrating the founding of Rome and the pastoral traditions that had given birth to the greatest empire the world had ever known. The festival took place every April 21st, marking the anniversary of the day when Romulus had first marked out the boundaries of what would become the Eternal City, and it drew hundreds of thousands of Romans who came to honor both their city's mythical origins and its continuing prosperity. The celebration began before dawn with the purification of the flocks that grazed in the hills around Rome, a ritual that connected the urban empire to its rural roots and reminded citizens that their power ultimately rested on the agricultural abundance that fed their armies and supported their expansion. Shepherds drove their animals through bonfires kindled with sacred herbs, while priests offered prayers for fertility and protection from disease. But the heart of the festival was the great ceremony that took place in the afternoon, when the entire population of Rome seemed to gather in the Campus Martius to participate in rituals that would ensure the city's continued prosperity for another year. The Vestals had crucial roles in the ceremony, serving as the primary intermediaries between the human and divine realms, their presence lending sacred authority to proceedings that might otherwise seem like mere civic celebration. Flavia had performed these duties dozens of times before, moving through the elaborate choreography of faith with practiced grace and genuine devotion. The rituals were second nature to her now, the precise movements, the ancient words, the careful handling of sacred objects that must never be touched by profane hands. She found deep satisfaction in the perfect execution of ceremonies that linked her personally to the divine powers that protected Rome, and she had never experienced any difficulty maintaining her focus during even the most complex religious observances. The ritual itself was a masterpiece of religious theater designed to involve every sense and emotion in the worship of the gods. The air was thick with the smoke of burning herbs and incense, creating aromatic clouds that were believed to carry prayers directly to the heavens. The sound of chanting priests, singing choirs, and musical instruments created a wall of sacred sound that seemed to transform the very atmosphere into something holy and set apart from ordinary experience. Flavia's role was to move through the crowd, carrying a silver vessel filled with sacred water drawn from the spring of Egeria, sprinkling drops on the assembled worshippers to purify them and prepare them to receive divine blessings. The water had been blessed that morning in elaborate ceremonies at the temple, and each drop was believed to carry actual spiritual power that could protect against evil influences and ensure divine favor. As she performed this duty, moving in the slow, graceful patterns that her training had made automatic, she was supposed to maintain a state of perfect spiritual concentration, her mind focused entirely on the prayers she recited and the sacred significance of her actions. For 10 years, this had never been a problem. Her training was thorough, her faith was strong, and she had developed the ability to shut out all distractions and focus entirely on her religious duties. But that day, something was different, something that would change the course of her life forever. As she sprinkled the holy water over the assembled crowd, moving in the careful patterns prescribed by centuries of tradition, her eyes met those of a young man standing near the front of the gathering. He was perhaps 25, with the confident bearing of someone who had served in the legions, but now wore the white toga of a citizen engaged in civilian pursuits. His hair was dark brown, almost black, curling slightly at his temples in a way that suggested recent military service, where it had been kept shorter and more strictly controlled. His eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, intelligent and kind, with laugh lines that spoke of someone who found joy in life despite the serious responsibilities that came with Roman citizenship. His face was strong but not harsh, with the kind of bone structure that would age well and the kind of expression that suggested both competence and compassion. When their eyes locked across the crowd of worshippers, something electric and utterly unexpected passed between them. It was as if lightning had struck her, illuminating parts of herself that she hadn't known existed and setting her entire being ablaze with sensations that she had no words to describe and no framework for understanding. For just a moment, no more than a single heartbeat, the elaborate ceremony faded into background noise. The chanting of the priests, the smell of burning herbs and incense, the weight of her sacred robes, the presence of hundreds of observers, all of it receded until there was nothing in the world but those green eyes looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart skip in her chest. It was as if she had been living her entire life in black and white, and suddenly the world had burst into vivid color. Every sensation seemed heightened, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, the feeling of the sacred water vessel in her hands, the texture of her robes against her skin. But more than that, it was as if some essential part of herself that had been sleeping for 18 years had suddenly awakened and was demanding recognition. The moment seemed to stretch out forever, as if time itself had been suspended to allow her to experience this revelation fully. She felt herself becoming suddenly, urgently human in ways that her vows explicitly forbade, aware of her body not as a temple dedicated to divine service, but as the vessel of a woman who was capable of desire and passion and all the complex emotions that came with being fully alive. Then the moment passed. Professional duty and years of rigorous training reasserted themselves, and she continued her ritual movements with the same grace and precision as always, sprinkling water, murmuring prayers, fulfilling her sacred obligations with the perfection that was expected of a Vestal Virgin. Her movements remained flawless, her voice steady, her demeanor appropriate to her sacred role. But throughout the rest of the ceremony, which lasted for several more hours and involved dozens of different ritual elements, she found herself stealing glances at the young man, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he thought no one was watching. She studied the way he moved during the various ritual responses required of the congregation, noting the natural grace that suggested athletic training and the careful attention that marked someone who took religious obligations seriously. She observed how he interacted with the people around him, respectfully but not obsequiously, with the confidence of someone secure in his social position, but without the arrogance that sometimes marked those born to privilege. When children near him grew restless during the long ceremony, she saw him quietly help distract them. And when an elderly woman seemed to be struggling with the physical demands of the ritual, he offered his arm for support without drawing attention to her difficulty. Everything she observed only intensified her fascination. This was not some shallow attraction based purely on physical appearance, though she had to admit that he was undeniably handsome. Instead, she found herself drawn to something deeper, the suggestion of character and kindness that showed in his actions, the intelligence that gleamed in his eyes, the sense that here was someone who might understand the complex thoughts and feelings that she had never been able to share with anyone. When the festival finally ended and the crowds began to disperse back to their daily lives, she told herself it was nothing, a momentary distraction, a kind of fleeting attraction that any woman might feel when confronted with masculine beauty and charm. It would pass, she reasoned, like hunger or fatigue or any other temporary discomfort of the flesh. She was a Vestal Virgin, consecrated to the goddess, trained from childhood to resist such impulses and maintain the perfect purity that her role demanded. She was wrong, so completely, catastrophically wrong. That night, for the first time in her adult life, Flavia dreamed of a man, not the abstract, theological concept of masculinity that featured in her religious education, not the distant figures of emperors and heroes from history and legend, but a specific man with green eyes and dark hair and a smile that made her stomach flutter with sensations she had no name for and no context to understand. In her dream, he reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers, and she leaned into that touch like a flower, turning toward the sun. His hands were warm and strong, and when he spoke her name, somehow in the dream, he knew her name. His voice was like music that resonated in her bones. She felt herself responding to his presence with every fiber of her being, drawn to him by forces that seemed to operate on a level deeper than conscious thought or deliberate choice. The dream itself was not explicitly sexual. Her sheltered upbringing and lack of experience left her without a clear understanding of physical intimacy. Instead, it was filled with emotional and spiritual longing, a sense of connection and completion that she had never experienced in her waking life. In the dream, being with him felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed but had been searching for unconsciously all her life. She woke with her heart racing and her body warm with feelings that her vows forbade her to acknowledge, let alone explore. The memory of the dream lingered throughout her morning duties, making her clumsy and distracted in ways that could have been dangerous if anyone had noticed. She nearly let the sacred fire burn too low while lost in reverie, caught herself just in time to add the necessary fuel and restore the flame to its proper brightness. The physical sensations that lingered from the dream were unlike anything she had ever experienced. There was a warmth that seemed to pool in her belly and radiate outward, a heightened sensitivity that made even the touch of her robes against her skin feel different, more immediate and somehow significant. Her body felt foreign to her, as if she were inhabiting it for the first time and discovering capabilities and responses that had been hidden from her understanding. Over the following weeks, she found herself watching for him whenever she appeared in public, her eyes searching crowds with an intensity that she tried to keep hidden but which colored every public appearance she made. During religious processions through the streets of Rome, her attention was divided between her ceremonial duties and her desperate hope of catching another glimpse of that unforgettable face. At gladiatorial games, where the Vestals had their honored seats in the front row of the imperial box, she found herself scanning the audience rather than watching the combats in the arena. The games themselves, which had once held her attention with their displays of skill and courage, now seemed like distant background noise compared to the urgent need to see him again and discover whether that moment of connection had been real or merely a product of her imagination. In the forum when she conducted the order's business affairs, consulting with lawyers about property matters, meeting with merchants who supplied the temple's needs, participating in the various civic ceremonies that required Vestal presence, she was constantly distracted by the possibility that he might appear. Every tall figure in the distance made her heart race. Every glimpse of dark hair caught her attention. Every man who bore even the slightest resemblance to him caused her pulse to quicken with hope and disappointment. She told herself repeatedly that she was being foolish beyond measure. She didn't even know his name, his family, his profession, or any of the basic facts that would allow her to understand who he was and what place he occupied in Roman society. He was just another Roman citizen, no different from the thousands of others who populated the city and attended religious ceremonies as part of their civic duties. Her interest in him was inappropriate, dangerous, potentially disastrous for both of them if it were ever discovered and reported to the authorities. But knowing this intellectually did nothing to diminish the growing intensity of her fascination. If anything, the forbidden nature of her feelings seemed to make them stronger, more urgent, more impossible to ignore or dismiss. She found herself thinking about him at the most inappropriate moments, during prayers, while tending the sacred fire, in the middle of important ceremonial duties that required her complete attention. She began to construct elaborate fantasies about who he might be and what his life was like. Perhaps he was a young senator just beginning his political career, or a successful merchant with business interests throughout the empire, or a scholar who divided his time between legal practice and literary pursuits. She imagined conversations they might have about philosophy and poetry, debates about politics and religion, quiet moments of shared understanding that would confirm the connection she felt certain existed between them. The fantasies were innocent enough in their content. Her sheltered upbringing left her without a clear understanding of physical intimacy, and her religious training had given her no vocabulary for sexual desire. Instead, her imagination focused on emotional and intellectual connection, on the possibility of finding someone who could understand the complex thoughts and feelings that she had never been able to share with anyone else. But the emotional intensity of these fantasies was anything but innocent. She would lose herself in these imagined encounters for hours at a time, emerging from her reveries with a sense of loss and longing that grew stronger rather than weaker as the days passed. The contrast between the rich inner life she was developing around thoughts of him and the austere reality of her actual existence became increasingly difficult to bear. It was Claudia Quinta, the second eldest Vestal, who had served for 25 years, who first noticed Flavia's distraction and growing emotional turmoil. Claudia Quinta was a woman of sharp intelligence and deep compassion, someone who had watched younger Vestals struggle with the challenges of their calling and learned to recognize the signs of inner conflict before they could develop into serious problems that might threaten both the individual and the order as a whole. She had seen other young women go through similar struggles during her long years of service, and she understood that the transition from adolescence to full adulthood was particularly difficult for Vestals, who were forced to suppress natural development and desires that in other women would be considered normal and healthy. Her approach to such situations was gentle but firm, designed to help her younger sisters work through their difficulties while maintaining their commitment to their sacred vows. "You seem troubled lately," she observed one evening as they prepared the sacred salt cakes for the next day's ceremonies, their hands working the ancient dough while the eternal flame cast dancing shadows on the walls around them. The work was meditative and usually helped center the mind on spiritual matters, but she had noticed that Flavia seemed unusually distracted even during these peaceful activities. "Your mind wanders during prayers," Claudia Quinta continued, her voice gentle but concerned. "Yesterday you nearly let the flame burn too low while daydreaming, and this morning you forgot to add the proper amount of salt to the ceremonial cakes. These are not like you, sister. Something is weighing on your spirit." Flavia's cheeks flushed with shame at the observation, the color rising from her neck to her forehead in a way that confirmed Claudia Quinta's suspicions that the problem was more serious than simple fatigue or distraction. The sacred fire was their most important responsibility, and any negligence in its care was a serious breach of duty that could have consequences far beyond the personal. That she had been so distracted by thoughts of a man that she had nearly failed in her fundamental obligation filled her with self-loathing and terror about what might have happened if her lapse had gone unnoticed. "I've been preoccupied with theological questions," she lied, the words feeling awkward and false on her tongue. The lie came easily but tasted bitter, adding another layer of guilt to the complex emotions that were already threatening to overwhelm her. "I've been wondering about the nature of divine service, whether our duties truly honor Vesta as they should, whether there might be better ways to serve the goddess that we haven't considered." It was a plausible excuse. Young Vestals often went through periods of spiritual questioning as they matured and began to understand the full implications of their calling. But Claudia Quinta had too much experience reading human nature to be fooled by such transparent deception, especially when it was delivered with so little conviction and accompanied by such obvious physical signs of emotional distress. Claudia Quinta studied her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent 25 years learning to see through the masks that people wore to hide their true feelings. She had guided dozens of young women through various crises during her long service, and she recognized the particular kind of turmoil that was affecting Flavia with the certainty that came from experience. "Theological questions," she repeated slowly, her voice carefully neutral but somehow knowing, as if she could read the truth in Flavia's face despite the younger woman's attempts at concealment. "How interesting. In my experience, theological questions rarely cause a woman to blush quite so prettily, or to stare off into the distance with such longing expression. Nor do they typically result in the kind of absent-minded mistakes that suggest a mind is occupied with something far more personal than abstract spiritual concerns." The observation hit too close to the mark, and Flavia felt panic rising in her throat like bile, making it difficult to breathe or speak coherently. If Claudia Quinta suspected something, if she reported her concerns to Claudia Prima or, worse still, to the Pontifex Maximus, there would be an investigation. Questions would be asked about her recent behavior, her movements monitored more closely, her interactions with outsiders scrutinized for any sign of impropriety. The thought of such scrutiny was terrifying beyond words. Even if no actual wrongdoing was discovered, the mere fact of being investigated would mark her as someone whose loyalty and commitment were questionable. It would affect how she was viewed by her sisters, how much responsibility she was given, whether she would be trusted with the most important ceremonial duties. The suspicion alone could effectively end her career as a respected member of the order, leaving her to complete her remaining years of service under a cloud of doubt and distrust. "I assure you, my devotion to the goddess remains absolute," Flavia said, trying to keep her voice steady and convincing despite the fear that was making her hands tremble and her heart race. "My commitment to our sacred duties has never wavered. Perhaps I have been pushing myself too hard in my studies, trying to understand complex theological concepts that are beyond my current level of spiritual development." "I'm sure your devotion is sincere," Claudia Quinta replied mildly, but her eyes remained knowing and concerned, as if she could see straight through the carefully constructed facade to the turmoil beneath. But devotion and desire are not mutually exclusive, child. Even a Vestal Virgin has a heart that beats, blood that flows, dreams that come unbidden in the night. The question is not whether you feel such things. That would make you less than human, and the goddess has no use for inhuman servants. The question is what you choose to do with those feelings. The words carried layers of meaning that Flavia didn't dare explore too deeply, implications that both terrified and somehow comforted her. Was Claudia Quinta speaking from personal experience? Had she herself faced similar temptations during her long service, struggled with desires that her vows forbade her to acknowledge or act upon? Had other Vestals throughout history grappled with the same conflict between human nature and sacred duty that was now tearing Flavia apart? Or was this simply a warning, a gentle reminder of the boundaries that must not be crossed and the consequences that awaited those who allowed their human weaknesses to overcome their religious obligations? The ambiguity of Claudia Quinta's words made it impossible to know whether she was offering understanding and support or issuing a subtle threat, whether she was an ally who might help navigate these dangerous waters or a potential enemy who was gathering information for future use. Flavia didn't ask for clarification, and Claudia Quinta didn't elaborate, but the conversation left her more unsettled than ever, forced to confront the growing certainty that her feelings for the mysterious stranger were not the passing fancy she had hoped they would be. They were deepening with each day, becoming more specific, more vivid, more impossible to ignore or dismiss as temporary weakness. They were transforming her in ways that she was only beginning to understand, awakening parts of herself that had been dormant for 18 years and demanding recognition and expression that her vows made impossible. And she still didn't even know his name, had no way of finding out who he was or whether she would ever see him again. That ignorance, she told herself desperately, was what made the situation manageable. As long as he remained a stranger, a face in the crowd, her feelings could remain safely abstract, a private struggle that affected no one but herself. But fate, it seemed, had other plans entirely for her carefully ordered existence. The gods, who had claimed her as their own when she was 8 years old, apparently had a particularly cruel sense of irony when it came to testing the faith and resolve of their most devoted servants. And they were about to arrange circumstances that would transform her private struggle into something far more dangerous and immediate than she could possibly have imagined. Fate, it seemed, had developed a particularly cruel and elaborate sense of irony where Flavia's life was concerned, as if the gods themselves were orchestrating events to test the strength of her vows and the depth of her commitment to the sacred life she had been living for 10 years. 3 weeks after the Perilia, she was summoned to meet with Marcus Flavius Aper, the newly appointed praetor urbanus, the magistrate responsible for civil law within the city of Rome. The summons came through official channels, delivered by a clerk from the praetor's office who spoke with the formal courtesy that marked all interactions between government officials and the Vestals. Such meetings were not unusual in themselves. The Vestals occasionally consulted with various officials on matters where religious law intersected with civil jurisprudence, their expertise in sacred traditions making them valuable advisors when legal questions touched on matters of divine will or religious propriety. The Vestals were considered the foremost experts on religious law in the empire, and their opinions carried great weight in cases involving marriage, inheritance, adoption, and other matters where the favor of the gods might be crucial to reaching a just resolution. Their involvement in legal consultations was part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, recognizing that Roman law was not merely a human construction, but a reflection of divine will that required proper interpretation by those who understood the sacred principles underlying civil society. The Vestal's supposed connection to divine wisdom made them natural arbiters in cases where purely secular considerations might lead to outcomes that violated religious principles or offended the gods. What was unusual about this particular consultation was the specific subject matter that had prompted the meeting, and the timing that would prove so momentous for Flavia's carefully ordered existence. She had no way of knowing, as she prepared for what seemed like a routine professional obligation, that she was about to walk into a situation that would fundamentally alter the course of her life. There's been a question raised, Praetor Aper explained as Flavia was shown into his office in the Forum Romanum, a grand space lined with law books and decorated with busts of famous jurists, regarding the interpretation of marriage contracts when one party dies before the ceremony is completed. The legal implications are complex, involving inheritance rights and the transfer of dowry property, but there are religious elements that fall squarely under your expertise. The office itself was a testament to Roman legal scholarship, its walls lined with scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries of jurisprudence. Bronze busts of legendary legal minds gazed down from their niches. Gaius, whose institutes had systematized Roman law; Papinian, whose opinions were considered nearly sacred; Ulpian, whose writings on jurisprudence were consulted throughout the empire. The very atmosphere of the room spoke of serious intellectual endeavor and the weighty responsibility of interpreting laws that govern the lives of millions. Flavia nodded politely, her mind already turning to the relevant theological principles and sacred precedents that might apply to such a case. Marriage was indeed a sacred institution in Roman society, blessed by the gods and governed by rituals that required divine approval for their validity. The proper conduct of marriage ceremonies, the religious requirements for valid unions, and the spiritual implications of incomplete or interrupted marriages were all matters that fell within the Vestal's purview to advise upon. I will be happy to consult our archives and provide whatever guidance I can, she began in her most professional manner, drawing upon 10 years of experience in such consultations to project the competent authority that her role required. The religious aspects of marriage law are indeed complex, and the intersection with civil jurisprudence requires careful analysis to ensure that both divine will and human justice are properly served. Then she stopped abruptly, the words dying in her throat as a familiar figure entered the room behind the praetor's secretary, and her carefully maintained professional composure shattered like glass striking stone. It was him, the man with the green eyes who had haunted her dreams for 3 weeks. "Ah, excellent timing," Praetor Aper said, seemingly oblivious to Flavia's sudden paralysis and the way her face had gone pale beneath her white veil. "Allow me to introduce Gaius Marius Calvus, my assistant in this matter. He's been researching the legal precedents, while you will provide the religious perspective. Together, I'm sure you can resolve this question to everyone's satisfaction." Gaius Marius Calvus. Finally, she had a name to attach to the face that had completely disrupted her peace of mind and turned her ordered existence into an emotional chaos that threatened everything she had worked to achieve. The sound of his name seemed to resonate in her mind like a bell, creating associations and connections that she had no right to make, but could not prevent herself from forming. "It is an honor to meet you, Sacred Vestal," Gaius said, stepping forward and offering the deep, respectful bow that protocol required when addressing one of her order. His voice was exactly as she remembered from her dreams, warm, intelligent, with undertones of humor and kindness that suggested both competence and compassion. But when he straightened and their eyes met directly for the first time since that moment during the festival, she saw the same shock of recognition that she was experiencing, the same electric awareness that had passed between them 3 weeks ago. He remembered her, had perhaps been thinking of her as much as she had been thinking of him. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, confirming that the connection she had felt was real while simultaneously making her situation infinitely more dangerous. "The honor is mine," she managed to reply, proud that her voice remained steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Years of training in maintaining composure during public ceremonies served her well now, allowing her to project calm authority even while her inner world was erupting into chaos. For the next hour, they worked together on a legal question with the kind of scholarly thoroughness that such matters demanded, consulting scrolls and debating interpretations with the dry precision of trained lawyers. To any observer, particularly Praetor Aper, who remained in the room throughout their consultation, it would have appeared perfectly professional. A Vestal Virgin and a junior magistrate conducting the routine business of Roman law with appropriate dignity and competence. The case itself was indeed complex, involving a situation where a prominent citizen had died in a chariot accident just days before his scheduled wedding to the daughter of another leading family. The question was whether the incomplete marriage created any legal obligations regarding the dowry that had already been transferred, the inheritance rights of the intended bride, and the religious status of a woman who had been prepared for marriage but never actually completed the ceremony. From a purely legal standpoint, the precedents were mixed and contradictory. Some cases suggested that the engagement itself created binding obligations that survived the death of one party, while others indicated that an incomplete marriage had no legal standing whatsoever. The civil courts were reluctant to make a definitive ruling without understanding the religious implications, particularly given the prominent social standing of the families involved. According to my research, Gaius explained, consulting a scroll that documented similar cases from previous decades, there are 3 relevant precedents from the reign of Trajan. In each case, the engagement was considered legally binding even after death, which means the dowry transfer was valid and created certain obligations regarding the bride's future marriage prospects. But beneath the surface of professional competence, something much more dangerous was happening. Every time their fingers brushed while handling the same document, Flavia felt as though lightning was coursing through her veins, creating sensations that were utterly foreign to her experience, but which seemed to awaken something deep and primitive in her nature. When Gaius leaned close to point out a particular passage in a legal text, his proximity made her dizzy with emotions she had no experience interpreting or context for understanding. The scent of his skin, clean and masculine, touched with the ink stains that marked his profession and something else that was uniquely him, seemed to fill her senses and make it difficult to concentrate on the scholarly discussion they were supposed to be having. She found herself memorizing details that had nothing to do with legal interpretation. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the small scar on his left hand that might have come from military service, the precise shade of green in his eyes when the afternoon light struck them at certain angles. The sound of his voice as he explained complex legal principles became a kind of music that she wanted to listen to forever, regardless of the actual content of his words. There was something hypnotic about the way he spoke, intelligent and thoughtful, but with an underlying warmth that suggested humor and humanity beneath the professional competence. She found herself hanging on his every word, not because of any great fascination with jurisprudence, but because hearing him speak felt like a luxury she had been denied all her life without realizing what she was missing. And worst of all, she could see in his eyes that he was experiencing something similar. The careful professional demeanor couldn't quite mask the way his gaze lingered on her face when he thought the praetor wasn't looking, the slight tremor in his hands when they accidentally touched, the increased warmth in his voice when he addressed her directly rather than speaking to both her and their official observer. The religious perspective on this matter, Flavia managed to say, forcing herself to focus on the legal question despite the emotional storm raging within her, would emphasize the importance of divine approval in marriage contracts. An engagement that has received proper religious blessing creates spiritual obligations that transcend the mere civil aspects of the union. She went on to explain the theological principles involved, drawing on her extensive training in religious law to provide the kind of authoritative interpretation that would satisfy the courts and the families involved. But even as she spoke with professional competence about sacred traditions and divine will, part of her mind was entirely occupied with the man sitting beside her and the unprecedented feelings he was awakening in her. When the meeting finally concluded and the legal question had been satisfactorily resolved, the combination of legal precedent and religious guidance provided a solid foundation for the court's decision. Flavia found herself reluctant to leave the praetor's office. She lingered, asking unnecessary questions about implementation and procedure, stretching out the conversation for as long as plausibility would allow, while her rational mind screamed warnings about the danger of such behavior. "Perhaps," Gaius said carefully, his voice neutral, but his eyes intense with meaning that only she could read. "It would be beneficial for us to meet again in a few days, to ensure that our interpretations align properly, and that all aspects of the question have been thoroughly addressed. Such complex matters often benefit from extended consultation to prevent future legal challenges." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. The legal question was straightforward enough. Their interpretations were already in perfect alignment, and there was no legitimate reason for further meetings. Any competent lawyer could implement their joint recommendations without additional guidance, and both of them understood that what was being proposed went far beyond professional consultation. But Flavia found herself nodding agreement with an eagerness that she should have been ashamed of, her professional training apparently powerless against the desperate need to see him again that was overwhelming every other consideration. "That would be prudent," she said, the word feeling inadequate for what was really being arranged between them, "to ensure the goddesses will is properly understood in these matters, and that no important religious considerations have been overlooked in our analysis." "Indeed," he replied, and the way he said the word made it clear that they were no longer talking about legal interpretation at all, but about something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Walking back to the Atrium Vesti that afternoon, Flavia felt as though she were moving through a dream landscape, where familiar things had been transformed into something strange and new. The familiar streets of Rome seemed charged with possibilities that had not existed that morning, every shadow and doorway suggesting secrets and opportunities that she had never noticed before. The weight of her sacred robes, usually a source of pride and security that connected her to her holy calling, now felt like a burden she was increasingly reluctant to bear. She had crossed a line today. She knew with absolute certainty, not in action. Their behavior had been entirely appropriate by any objective standard that could be judged by outside observers, but an intention and desire, and the silent acknowledgement that had passed between them like an electric current. She had taken the first step down a path that could only lead to disaster for both of them. The smart thing, the safe thing, the sacred thing would be to send word immediately that no further consultation was necessary, to avoid any future contact with Gaius Marius Calvus, to forget his green eyes and the way his voice made her feel, to throw herself back into her religious duties with renewed fervor, and pray to Vesta for the strength to resist temptation that threatened everything she had sworn to uphold. But as she entered the sacred precincts of her home and began to prepare for the evening service, as she knelt before the eternal flame and tried to focus her mind on prayers that had sustained her for 10 years, Flavia knew with crystalline certainty that she was going to see him again. The question that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure was what would happen when she did, and whether she would have the strength to maintain the barriers that were all that stood between her current life and utter catastrophe. The second meeting was arranged for 3 days later, ostensibly to review the final documentation for the legal matter they had resolved and to ensure that their joint interpretation would stand up to scrutiny from higher authorities. The intervening days passed with agonizing slowness for Flavia, each hour dragging by as she struggled to maintain her normal routines, while her mind was entirely occupied with anticipation and terror about what was to come. Instead of the formal setting of the praetor's office, with its official atmosphere and constant interruptions, Gaia suggested they meet in the gardens of Sallust, a semi-public space where they could speak privately without attracting the kind of attention that might come from being seen together in too formal a setting. The gardens were beautiful and peaceful, he explained, providing an environment conducive to thoughtful discussion of complex legal and religious matters. Flavia knew she should have insisted on a more conventional venue. The gardens of Sallust were beautiful, romantic even, with their meandering paths lined with flowering trees. Their secluded groves where lovers often met for private conversations. Their fountains and statues that created intimate spaces perfect for the kind of personal interaction that she was supposed to avoid at all costs. It was exactly the kind of place where inappropriate intimacies could develop between people who should maintain strictly professional relationships. But the prospect of being alone with him, away from the watchful eyes of magistrates and clerks, away from the formal constraints that had made their previous meeting feel so stilted and artificial, despite the electricity that had crackled between them, was too tempting to resist. She told herself that she could maintain appropriate boundaries, even in a more relaxed setting, that her training and commitment to her vows would protect her from any serious temptation. She was wrong about that, as she was wrong about so many things during this period when desire was overwhelming judgment and transforming her from a model Vestal into something she barely recognized. She arrived first, choosing a marble bench near a fountain dedicated to Venus, goddess of love, patron of desires that were absolutely forbidden to a Vestal Virgin. The irony of the location was not lost on her, but the sound of the water was soothing, and the spot was far enough from the main paths to offer privacy, while still being technically public enough to maintain the fiction that this was a professional consultation. The fountain itself was a masterpiece of Roman sculpture, depicting Venus rising from the sea foam that had given her birth, her marble features serene and beautiful as water cascaded around her eternal form. Smaller figures of Cupid and other love deities frolicked among carved dolphins and sea creatures, creating a scene of joyous celebration that seemed to mock Flavia's internal struggle between duty and desire. When Gaius appeared, walking toward her with a scroll case that was obviously more prop than necessity, Flavia felt her breath catch in exactly the same way it had during their first encounter. Seeing him in daylight, without the formal constraints of an official meeting, she could appreciate details that had been lost in the shadows of the praetor's office and the distractions of their professional obligations. He was taller than she had remembered, with the lean, powerful build of a man who had served in the legions before returning to civilian life. His movements had the controlled grace that came from military training, but softened by years of civilian pursuits into something more elegant and less threatening. His hands were strong but elegant, marked with ink stains that spoke of long hours spent with legal documents, but also showing the calluses and small scars of someone who had once carried a sword and shield in service to Rome. When he smiled, and he was smiling now, as he approached her bench with an expression of genuine pleasure at seeing her again, it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable than his serious professional demeanor suggested. There was warmth in that smile, and something else that might have been relief, as if he too had been uncertain whether she would actually come to this meeting. "Sacred Vestal," he said, offering the formal greeting that propriety required, but his tone was warm with genuine pleasure and perhaps a hint of nervousness that made him seem more human and less intimidating. "Thank you for agreeing to this consultation. I hope the location is suitable for our discussion." "Of course," she replied, gesturing for him to sit beside her on the bench, acutely aware of how the simple action brought him close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his skin mixed with something that might have been expensive oil used for bathing, and see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of intelligence and humor. "Though I confess, I've reviewed our conclusions from the other day extensively, and I believe we reached a satisfactory resolution. I'm not certain what additional guidance I can provide." It was a test, she realized as soon as the words left her mouth, an opportunity for him to maintain the pretense that this meeting was purely professional, to keep their relationship within the safe boundaries of religious and legal consultation, an escape route that would allow them both to retreat to safer ground before they said or did something that could not be taken back or explained away as innocent professional interaction. Instead, he set the scroll case aside without even opening it, the gesture so deliberate and meaningful that it felt like a declaration of intent. Then he looked at her directly, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though the rest of the world had suddenly become very distant and unimportant. "To be honest," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that made her heart race with emotions she was still learning to identify, "I requested this meeting because I wanted to see you again. Not the Vestal Virgin, not the sacred priestess of Rome whose wisdom is sought by magistrates and whose presence blesses our ceremonies, but you, Flavia." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such gentle intimacy and obvious affection, made her feel as though the world had tilted on its axis. No one had called her simply Flavia in 15 years. Since her consecration, she had been sacred Vestal, Flavia Maxima, sister. Even her fellow Vestals addressed her by her religious title more often than her given name, maintaining the formal distance that their shared calling seemed to require. The simple use of her birth name felt more intimate than any physical touch could have been, a recognition of the person she had been before the gods claimed her. The girl who had played with dolls in her father's garden and dreamed of adventures that had nothing to do with tending sacred flames or maintaining ritual purity. "That is dangerous," she whispered, though she made no move to leave, no gesture toward the scroll case, or any attempt to restore their conversation to professional matters. The words seemed inadequate to describe the magnitude of what they were contemplating, the risks they were both taking simply by sitting together in this garden and speaking with such honesty about feelings that could destroy them both. "I know," he replied without hesitation, his voice steady, but his eyes showing the same mix of fear and desperate hope that she was struggling to hide. "For both of us. If anyone discovered that I had inappropriate feelings for a Vestal Virgin, my career would be over before it had truly begun. My reputation would be destroyed, my family shamed by association with my disgrace. I could be exiled from Rome, stripped of citizenship, left to wander the world as a man without a country or honor." He paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing with even greater honesty. "But the personal consequences would be nothing compared to the political implications. I could be accused of sacrilege, of attempting to corrupt a sacred priestess. The charges would be serious enough to warrant extreme punishment, and my death would be neither quick nor merciful. And I could be buried alive," she said simply, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. The brutal reality of her situation hung in the air around them, a stark reminder of the stakes they were contemplating that made everything else seem insignificant by comparison. The punishment for a Vestal who violated her vows was not merely death, but something designed to satisfy religious law while avoiding the technical violation of shedding sacred blood. She would be sealed in an underground chamber with minimal food and water, left to die slowly in darkness, while Rome tried to forget she had ever existed. It was a fate that haunted the nightmares of every Vestal, a constant reminder of the price of weakness or failure. For a moment, the magnitude of the risk seemed to restore some measure of sanity to the situation. What were they doing? What madness was this, that they would even consider pursuing something so dangerous, so impossible, so utterly catastrophic for both their lives? The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the need to retreat immediately, to restore appropriate boundaries, before it was too late to prevent disaster. But then Gaius reached out, very slowly, telegraphing his intention so clearly that she could have pulled away at any moment if she had chosen to do so, and touched her hand where it rested on the marble bench. Just the lightest contact, his fingers barely brushing hers, but the sensation shot through her like lightning striking a tall tree in a summer storm. His touch was everything she had imagined and nothing she could have prepared for. His skin was warm and slightly rough from his years of military service, but his touch was incredibly gentle, as if he understood exactly how precious and fragile this moment was for both of them. The simple contact seemed to create a connection that went far beyond the physical, as if some essential part of herself was recognizing its match in him. "I know the dangers," he said softly, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her knuckles that sent shivers through her entire body. "I've spent 3 sleepless nights telling myself all the reasons why I should forget about you, why I should return to my work and my duties, and pretend that meeting you changed nothing in my life. I've rehearsed speeches about duty and honor and the importance of respecting sacred boundaries." His voice dropped even lower, becoming almost a whisper that seemed to wrap around her like silk. "But I can't, Flavia. I close my eyes and see your face. I try to concentrate on legal documents and find myself writing your name in the margins without realizing what I'm doing. I've never felt anything like this before, and I'm beginning to understand that I never will again, regardless of what happens between us." Neither had she, but admitting that felt like crossing another line, acknowledging truths that were better left unspoken if she had any hope of maintaining the barriers that protected them both. Instead, she looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt despite how wrong she knew it was. His skin was warm against hers, and she could feel the steady pulse of his heartbeat through his wrist where it rested against hers. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the fountain and the distant conversations of other people enjoying the gardens. It was a question that terrified her to ask because she was afraid of the answer, afraid that he wanted things she couldn't give without destroying everything she had built her life around. "I don't know," he admitted with honesty that was somehow more seductive than any practiced charm could have been. "I haven't thought that far ahead, haven't made any plans beyond this moment. I only know that I had to see you again, had to tell you how I feel, had to discover if you might feel something similar. Everything else we can figure out together, if you're willing." She could have lied, should have lied, could have claimed that her heart belonged entirely to the goddess, that she felt nothing but religious duty and sacred purpose, that his feelings were not reciprocated and never could be. It would have been safer for both of them, would have ended this dangerous flirtation before it could develop into something truly catastrophic that would destroy both their lives. Instead, she turned her hand palm up and interlaced her fingers with his, the simple gesture speaking more clearly than any words could have. The moment their palms touched fully, she felt something shift inside her, as if a door that had been locked for 18 years had suddenly swung open to reveal possibilities she had never imagined. "I do," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest, where she had been trying to bury these feelings since the moment they first appeared. "Feel something similar, I mean, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever experienced in my life. More than the ceremony that made me a Vestal, more than the responsibility of tending the sacred flame, more than the thought of divine punishment for failure in my duties." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined on the marble bench, neither speaking, both lost in the implications of what they had just admitted to each other. Around them, the gardens of Sallust hummed with afternoon activity, other couples walking the paths, children playing near the fountains, merchants and citizens going about their daily business in the casual way of people whose lives were not balanced on the edge of catastrophe. But Flavia felt as though they existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world, a space where impossible things might somehow become possible if they were careful enough, clever enough, brave enough to navigate the dangers that surrounded them on every side. "Tell me about yourself," she said finally, desperate to know more about this man who had so completely disrupted her carefully ordered existence and transformed her from a devoted priestess into a woman consumed by desires she had never expected to feel. your family, your childhood, how you came to work in the law courts. I want to understand who you are when you're not being a magistrate. Gaius seemed to understand her need to make him real, to transform him from the mysterious stranger of her fantasies into a flesh and blood person with the history and the future that she could comprehend. His fingers tightened slightly around hers as he began to speak, his voice taking on the warm, reminiscent tone of someone remembering happier times. I was born in the countryside outside Rome, he said, and she could hear the affection in his voice for the place that had shaped him. My father owns a farm that's been in our family for 3 generations. Not a grand estate like those owned by senators, but prosperous enough to provide a good life. We grow grain and olives, raise sheep and cattle, live simply but well. He told her about his youth and the rolling hills that surrounded the city, where the pace of life was measured by seasons rather than the frantic political calendar that governed urban existence, about helping with the harvest, learning to read the weather and understand the rhythms of agriculture that fed the empire, about long summer evenings when his family would gather outside their modest villa to watch the stars appear and listen to his grandfather tell stories about the family's history. I was the youngest of 4 sons, which meant I wouldn't inherit the land, he continued, his expression growing more thoughtful. So my parents decided to invest in my education, to give me opportunities that weren't available in rural life. They sent me to Rome when I was 14 to live with a distant cousin and attend the schools that would prepare me for a career in law or administration. She could picture him as a young man, probably homesick and overwhelmed by the complexity of city life after the simplicity of the countryside. The transition must have been difficult, requiring him to master not only academic subjects, but the social skills necessary to navigate urban society, where connections and reputation mattered as much as ability. The transition was harder than I expected, he admitted, as if reading her thoughts. The city was so much larger and more complicated than anything I had experienced. The noise, the crowds, the constant political intrigue. It took me months to feel comfortable there, but I was determined to succeed, to justify my parents' investment in my future. He told her about the long hours spent memorizing legal precedents and rhetorical techniques, the competitions with other students that tested both knowledge and speaking ability, the gradual realization that he had a gift for understanding the complexities of Roman jurisprudence and arguing cases with clarity and conviction. I discovered that I enjoyed the intellectual challenge of the law, he said, his enthusiasm evident in his voice, finding the precise precedent that would support a client's case, crafting arguments that would persuade judges, working out the logical implications of different legal principles. It felt like solving puzzles, but puzzles that mattered because they affected real people's lives. "And military service?" she asked, noting the small scars on his hands and the way he carried himself that suggested familiarity with weapons and combat. 3 years in Germania, he said, his expression growing more serious. It's required for anyone who wants a political career, and my family hoped that military service would open doors that might otherwise remain closed to someone from our background. I served with the 10th Legion, mostly fighting barbarian tribes along the Rhine frontier. He described the harsh conditions of frontier warfare, the constant alertness required when facing enemies who could strike without warning, the bonds of loyalty that developed between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. But he also spoke of the loneliness of camp life, the long periods of boredom between battles, the growing certainty that his talents lay in other directions. I learned that I much preferred the battles of the courtroom to those of the battlefield, he said with a slight smile. Violence has its place in defending the empire, but I found more satisfaction in resolving conflicts through negotiation and legal argument than through force of arms. When my service was complete, I was eager to return to civilian life. When he returned to Rome, he had been fortunate enough to catch the attention of Praetor Aper, who was looking for assistance with both military experience and legal training. The position offered excellent opportunities for advancement, exposure to important cases, and the chance to develop the reputation that would be essential for future success. And marriage? Flavia asked, surprised by her own boldness in broaching such a personal subject, but desperate to understand where she fit into the life he had planned for himself. Do your plans include a wife and family? They did, he said carefully, his eyes studying her face, as if trying to gauge her reaction to his words. My parents have been suggesting suitable matches for the past 2 years. Well-connected families with daughters of appropriate breeding and dowry. Several negotiations have been started, contracts discussed, meetings arranged between the families. Flavia felt a complicated mixture of relief and guilt at his words. Relief that he was not already committed to another woman, that she was not actively interfering with an existing relationship that would be destroyed by his interest in her, but guilt that her very existence was preventing him from making the kind of marriage that would advance his career and satisfy his family's expectations for his future. But somehow, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, somehow I keep finding excuses to delay such arrangements. I tell myself it's because I want to establish myself more firmly in my career first, because I want to be certain of my prospects before taking on the responsibilities of marriage and family. But now I think I was waiting for something else entirely. He turned to look at her directly, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Waiting for you, perhaps, though I didn't know it at the time. Waiting for someone who would make me understand what all the poets meant when they wrote about love that changes everything. In turn, she told him about her own life, carefully edited, but surprisingly honest, given the constraints of her position. She spoke of her childhood in her father's house, the shock of being chosen for sacred service, the years of adjustment to her new life within the confines of the atrium vesti. She described the routines that had structured her days for 10 years, the satisfaction she had found in religious service, the sense of purpose that came from knowing her work helped protect Rome itself. But she also shared things she had never told anyone, the loneliness that was never quite acknowledged in discussions of Vestal privilege, the way she sometimes watched other women with their husbands and children and felt an ache she had no right to experience. The questions that had begun to trouble her about whether the life she was living was truly what she wanted or simply what had been chosen for her when she was too young to understand the implications. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked gently, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair back from her face in a gesture so tender it made her eyes fill with tears. The choice that was made for you when you were too young to understand what you were giving up. "It wasn't a choice," she reminded him, leaning into his touch despite herself, hungry for the kind of gentle affection she had been denied for 15 years. "But yes, sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if another name had been drawn from the urn, whether I would have married, had children, experienced the ordinary joys and sorrows that most women take for granted." "And now?" he asked, a question heavy with implication about how meeting him had changed her perspective on the life she was living. The question hung between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond simple curiosity. Now that she had met him, now that she knew what attraction felt like, what desire meant, did she regret the vows that stood between them and any possibility of a normal life together? "Now I understand what I've been missing," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion that she was struggling to control. "And that makes the regret sharper, more specific. Before, I could tell myself that I was content with my life because I didn't know what alternatives existed. But now, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't put into words the magnitude of what she was feeling or the way that meeting him had illuminated the emptiness in her life that she had been trying so hard not to acknowledge. But he seemed to understand anyway, his arms coming around her to hold her close in a gesture of comfort that felt more natural and right than anything she had ever experienced. They spent the rest of the afternoon in each other's arms, talking and sharing the kind of intimate conversation that she had never imagined possible with another human being. He told her about his dreams of writing history someday, his fascination with the great figures of the past, his desire to leave something meaningful behind when his own life was over. She shared her love of poetry, her secret attempts at writing verse of her own, her curiosity about the world beyond Rome's borders. As the shadows began to lengthen toward evening, painting the garden in golden light that made everything seem touched with magic, they both understood that they had crossed a point of no return. Whatever happened next, they could never go back to being strangers who had shared only professional interaction. They had revealed too much, felt too much, acknowledged truths that would change everything about how they saw themselves and each other. When Flavia finally left the garden as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the fire burning in her heart, she felt as though she was carrying a secret that was too large for her body to contain. Every step back toward the atrium vesti felt like a betrayal of what she had discovered about herself, but also like a return to a prison that she was finally beginning to recognize as such. Walking through the darkening streets of Rome, she touched her lips, where she could still feel the phantom pressure of the gentle kiss he had given her as they parted. Their first kiss, brief and tender and full of promise for things that might be possible if they were brave enough to pursue them despite all the dangers that surrounded such pursuit. She was no longer the same woman who had left that morning for what was supposed to be a simple professional consultation. Something fundamental had changed. Some barrier had been crossed that could never be rebuilt or forgotten. For the first time in her life, Flavia Maxima was not just a Vestal Virgin dedicated to serving the goddess. She was a woman in love, completely and irrevocably in love with a man she could never have. And she was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for that love.